In his basement workshop, James sat surrounded by blueprints of his property's irrigation system. His hands shook, not with age, but with suppressed rage. On the security monitors he'd installed after the boundary dispute, he watched guests trampling deeper into his property. Someone had even moved his hand-carved bench to create a selfie station beside his tool shed. His first call was indeed to the police, but the dispatcher regretfully informed him that with the holiday weekend and 3 major accidents on the highway, officers wouldn't arrive for at least 3 hours. His second call was to his lawyer's emergency line, where he left a detailed message while pulling up the property's irrigation management software on his tablet. The system had been his biggest retirement splurge, a cutting-edge setup with 12 programmable zones, rain sensors, and enough pressure to support commercial landscaping needs. The technician who'd installed it had jokingly called it overkill for a residential property, but James had insisted on the best. Now, he pulled up the custom interface he'd designed himself. Most people's irrigation systems had basic timers. James's was practically a water choreography studio. He methodically documented the destruction, photographing license plates and faces. Then he called his insurance agent, describing the situation and ensuring his policy would cover malicious property damage. "Just so I'm clear," his agent asked, "you're saying 50+ cars are parked on your land without permission right now?" "Yes," James replied, watching a woman in stilettos sink into his soft lawn by the hydrangea beds. "And I've tried to resolve this peacefully." After ending the call, James turned back to his irrigation controls. What most people didn't know about modern sprinkler systems was their programmable versatility. Zones could be activated in sequences, with variable water pressure, oscillation patterns, and durations. As he worked, James added a final touch by connecting to his home audio system. The exterior speakers, installed for playing classical music to his plants, could serve a different purpose tonight. He glanced at his watch. The wedding reception was scheduled to end at midnight. It was now 11:45 p.m. At exactly 12:01 a.m., while the party showed no signs of ending, James's plan activated with Swiss precision. First came the music, emergency flood warning sirens blasting at maximum volume from speakers concealed throughout the gardens. The sudden noise caused several guests to spill their drinks, and the bride's father to nearly topple into the koi pond. 3 seconds later, the perimeter sprinklers engaged, creating a wall of water that effectively cut off escape routes while leaving the vehicles temporarily dry, an intentional design to ensure everyone was still on his property when the main event began. James watched from his security monitors as Diane ran toward his house, her designer dress already spattered with mud. Before she reached the halfway point, Phase 2 activated. The central zones erupted simultaneously, but with a crucial modification. James had adjusted each sprinkler head to its maximum height and pressure. Water shot 15 feet into the air before raining down with fire hose intensity. The carefully calibrated system ensured not a single square foot remained dry. The wedding guests, many intoxicated and all in formal wear, scattered like panicked cats. Women kicked off heels to run through the mud, and men abandoned suit jackets as impromptu umbrellas. The event photographer's equipment shorted out with an impressive spark, and the wedding cake, which had inexplicably been moved to James's pergola, collapsed under the onslaught. Diane reached his front door, pounding frantically. James opened it calmly, standing safely under the porch roof as she was drenched from a nearby oscillating sprinkler. "What are you doing?" she screamed, mascara streaming down her face. "Turn it off." James Foster hadn't always been territorial about his 3-acre countryside retreat. In fact, he'd been known as the neighborhood's most generous resident until the Henderson incident changed everything. After retiring from his high-stress architecture career, James poured his soul into transforming the neglected land into a horticultural masterpiece. His Japanese-inspired gardens had even been featured in a regional magazine, with the writer dubbing him the Lawn Whisperer. The centerpiece was a koi pond surrounded by rare flowering plants he'd sourced from 3 continents. When the adjacent property sold to become Forever Memories event venue, James initially welcomed the Henderson family with a basket of homegrown vegetables and a bottle of his award-winning homemade blackberry wine. Diane Henderson had accepted the gifts with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Those gardens of yours are absolutely gorgeous," she'd said, scanning his property with a calculating gaze. "I can see why you're so attached to them." Their cordial relationship lasted exactly 2 weeks. On a Tuesday afternoon, James returned from physical therapy for his bad knee to find surveyor stakes hammered into his prized azalea beds, shifting the property line 15 feet in the Hendersons' favor. After an expensive legal battle that drained his savings but restored his rightful boundaries, James thought the matter was settled. Then came Diane's seemingly innocent request to use just a tiny sliver of his land for overflow parking once or twice a year. "My sprinkler system runs on a precise schedule," James explained, showing her the complex control panel. "And the ground won't support vehicle weight without damaging the roof systems beneath." "Fine," Diane snapped, dropping her neighborly facade. "I was trying to be nice, but clearly you're one of those difficult old men who can't share. Good fences make good neighbors, isn't that what they say?" As she stormed off, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their battle. It was only the opening salvo. The following week, James noticed strange activities at the Henderson property. Construction crews worked late into the night, and delivery trucks arrived with portable toilets, tents, and pallets of folding chairs. The venue's modest gravel parking area remained unchanged, despite the obvious expansion of facilities. Walter Morgan, James's closest neighbor, stopped by with fresh-baked sourdough and neighborhood gossip. "Heard the Hendersons booked 15 weddings for the summer," Walter reported, settling into a chair on James's porch. "Diane's been bragging at the community board meetings about hosting Senator Abbott's daughter's wedding next month. 300 guests, according to the grapevine." James frowned, calculating the venue's capacity. "Their parking lot fits 40 cars maximum. Where do they plan to put everyone?" Walter's knowing look said everything. That evening, James reviewed the property surveys again and walked his boundaries, installing small reflective markers along the property line. He'd earned this sanctuary through decades of work, carefully selecting each plant variety and positioning each landscape feature for maximum harmony. The eastern meadow, which bordered the Hendersons' venue, might look like an unremarkable grassy field to outsiders, but beneath the surface ran thousands of dollars of irrigation infrastructure, feeding his rain harvesting system. The next morning brought another unwelcome visit from Diane, this time accompanied by her husband Richard, a former college football player whose imposing physique seemed designed for intimidation. "We've been reviewing the county ordinances," Diane announced without preamble, "and we've learned some interesting things about easements and right-of-way regulations." James remained seated in his garden chair, deliberately taking his time to mark his place in his book. "Is that so?" Richard stepped forward, towering over James. "The county says we have the right to reasonable access along shared boundaries. Your property blocks the only viable expansion route for our venue's facilities." "That's not what easements are for," James replied calmly, though his heart raced. "You might want to consult with a better attorney." Diane's smile tightened. "We've already spoken with Commissioner Jenkins. He's very supportive of small businesses bringing revenue to the county, unlike certain retirees who contribute nothing to the local economy." James stood slowly, leaning on his cane, a necessity since his knee surgery, but also a convenient prop when he wanted to appear more vulnerable than he was. "I paid property taxes on this land for 15 years, he said quietly. "And before you attempt another boundary dispute, you should know I've installed security cameras covering every inch of my property line." Richard's face darkened, but Diane placed a manicured hand on his arm. "We're not here to argue, James. We're simply informing you of the development plans for the area. Progress happens whether we embrace it or not." As they turned to leave, Diane paused. "By the way, we noticed your sprinkler system runs at midnight. Such a waste of water. You might want to adjust that schedule, especially since the county is considering water conservation ordinances that would restrict such excessive irrigation." The threat was thinly veiled. James watched them retreat to their luxury SUV, his mind already calculating his next move. If Diane Henderson wanted a war over his land, she'd find him a far more formidable opponent than she expected. The invitation to his nephew's graduation meant James would be away for exactly 8 hours, a detail he'd mentioned to several neighbors, including Diane's teenage son, who mowed lawns in the area. When James returned home earlier than planned due to a migraine, he crested the hill to a sight that made his blood pressure spike dangerously. A sea of vehicles, luxury SUVs, sports cars, even a limousine, covered the eastern section of his property. Temporary floodlights had been staked directly through his irrigation lines, and a makeshift valet station operated from beneath his prized magnolia tree. What struck him most wasn't just the vehicles but the transformation. Henderson's staff had cut a crude path through his native wildflower meadow, a carefully balanced ecosystem that had taken 3 years to establish. Wooden planks had been laid across his koi pond as a charming rustic photo bridge, where a bride and groom now posed. James parked at his neighbor Walter's house and approached on foot, documenting everything with his phone. When he reached the edge of the chaos, he spotted Diane in an expensive lavender dress, directing a Ferrari to park directly atop his rare Himalayan blue poppies. "You need to remove these vehicles immediately," James said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "This is private property." Diane's smile remained fixed as she turned to him. "James, I thought you were out of town until midnight. That doesn't give you permission to—" "Look, it's the abbot's daughter's wedding," she interrupted, lowering her voice and gripping his arm. "They're practically Connecticut royalty. The father is a state senator. We had 60 unexpected plus ones show up, and I made an executive decision." She pressed something into his palm. "A check. $500 for your trouble. We'll be wrapped up by midnight." James looked down at the check, then at the bride now drunkenly splashing in his koi pond as her new husband cheered. "This isn't about money," James said, pocketing his phone and the check. "You're destroying years of work." "It's just plants," Diane laughed, already turning away. "They grow back." As James walked away, he heard her mutter to a staff member, "Some people simply don't understand business." What's he going to do? Call the cops on a senator's daughter's wedding? "I'm afraid I can't," James replied, holding up his tablet to show a flashing error message. The system's safety override has activated. It happens when unauthorized individuals tamper with the in-ground sensors, like when they stake tents and lights into the soil. "This is Teji," Diane shrieked, attempting to shield herself with a decorative porch cushion. "Actually, it's a documented system malfunction," James corrected her, "one that won't resolve until the full cycle completes at 6 am. Something I mentioned when you asked to use my property." He handed her a towel. "I'd recommend moving those vehicles before Zone 3 activates. That's where I distribute the fertilizer." Behind Diane, a new wave of chaos erupted as the sprinklers suddenly changed patterns, now shooting horizontally instead of vertically. A groomsman slipped spectacularly into the mud while trying to reach his Maserati, and someone's toupee was launched into the walnut tree by a particularly powerful water jet. "You'll pay for this," Diane hissed, water dripping from her chin. "Interesting," James replied. "I have the same message for you." He held up his phone, showing her the time-stamped photos of her directing cars onto his property. "The police are on their way, but they're running late. Should arrive around the same time as the liquid fertilizer deployment." The legal notice arrived exactly 1 month after what local papers had dubbed the sprinkler soiree. James accepted the certified letter from his mail carrier with surprising good humor. "Another one?" asked Walter, who had stopped by to help restore the damaged koi pond. "The last one, I suspect," James replied, opening the envelope at his kitchen table. The Hendersons' initial threats of lawsuits had evaporated once James' attorney presented the evidence: security footage, the cancelled check Diane had offered as rental payment, creating a paper trail, and statements from 3 neighbors who'd witnessed Diane telling staff to park the overflow on the old man's lawn. "He's out of town." The final blow had been the series of social media posts from wedding guests themselves, tagging the venue while standing on James's property before the sprinkler incident. As it turned out, The senator was particularly unhappy about his daughter's $8,000 wedding dress being ruined, not by James's sprinklers, but by the venue's negligence in parking guests on private property without permission. "Well?" Walter asked, peering over his coffee mug. James smiled as he reviewed the settlement document. The Hendersons' insurance would cover complete restoration of his property by landscapers of his choosing, plus damages for the destroyed plants and his emotional distress. Diane's event venue would also be installing a permanent fence on their side of the property line and at their expense. "Justice," James said simply, signing the document. That afternoon, as the first of the landscaping trucks arrived, James sat on his porch watching the Henderson venue across the way. A new sign was being installed by their driveway, under new management. He was interrupted by the arrival of a delivery van carrying the first of his replacement plants, including several rare specimens he'd previously been unable to afford. "Where would you like these Japanese maple saplings, Mr. Foster?" the delivery person asked. James pointed to the area nearest the property line. "Right there," he said, "where everyone can enjoy them." As he supervised the unloading, his phone buzzed with a text from his nephew. "How's it going with the neighbor from hell?" James took a photo of the under new management sign and sent it with a simple caption, "Watered and gone." Then he turned his attention to the landscapers, already planning the new layout for his garden, which would now include a state-of-the-art irrigation system with twice the coverage and 3 times the pressure, just in case anyone else got creative ideas about his property.